Okay, so ready to dive in. Today we are tackling something that I think a lot of people only have a vague idea about, but it's something that we hear about all the time and something that impacts a ton of people.
Yeah, you got it. Evictions?
Evictions. It can sound so, dramatic. You picture these big fights and people getting thrown out on the street with all their stuff. But it turns out there's a whole legal process behind it all.
A lot more structured than people might think.
Way more. And we're going to break it all down for you today, all the ins and outs of how the eviction process actually works in the USA. We're basing this deep dive on a podcast episode we found called The Process of Filing an Eviction Notice in the USA.
Right, and it might seem like this is just for landlords, but it really isn't. I mean, anybody could end up renting a place at some point in their life.
Absolutely. Or even just knowing your rights as a tenant, like what a landlord can and cannot do. That's huge.
Totally. Or say you're thinking about buying a rental property someday.
Oh, yeah. You got to know the rules of the game. You got to know what you're getting into. So let's get into it. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you think evictions?
Well, probably why a landlord would even want to evict someone in the first place, right? Like, what are the valid reasons?
That's where the podcast starts, too. The hosts, Alex and Nia, they lay out some common scenarios.
They don't just jump into the legal stuff.
Not at all. They start with, the basics. Someone's not paying their rent. Pretty obvious, right?
Makes sense.
But then they get into other stuff like, what if a tenant's just trashing the place or having these wild parties every night?
So it's not just about the money.
Nope. There are lease violations too. Maybe they've got a pet when they weren't supposed to.
Oh, I've heard horror stories about that one.
Right. Or what if they're running some illegal business out of the apartment?
Whoa, that takes it to a whole other level.
Definitely. And it's important to note, landlords can't just evict someone because they don't like them.
Like their personality clashes or something?
Yeah.
Exactly. There has to be a legal reason. And get this, the specific reasons can actually vary depending on your state and even your local city laws.
So landlords really need to do their homework.
Huge takeaway right there. Know the rules. Okay, so say there is a legit reason and a landlord wants to evict someone. It's not like they can just yell at them to get out or something, right?
There's got to be some kind of process.
Yeah, it's all very official, a paper trail.
That makes sense. And that brings us to the eviction notice itself.
The formal eviction notice.
It's not just a sticky note on the door.
Right. This is a legal document. And Alex and Mia in the podcast, they explain that there are actually different types of notices depending on the situation. Like if it's just about unpaid rent, it's called a pay or quit notice.
Pay or quit, that's pretty self-explanatory.
Right. Basically, hey, pay up or get out. But if it's about a lease violation, things get a little trickier.
How so?
Then it might be what's called a cure or quit notice.
Cure or quit? I haven't heard that one before.
So this is for situations where the tenant might actually be able to fix the problem.
So if they're making too much noise.
Yeah, maybe they've got to turn down the music or start taking out the trash more often.
Interesting. So it's a chance to make things right.
Exactly. But for really serious stuff like illegal activities, a landlord might issue an unconditional quit notice.
So no second chances there.
Right. You got to go. And a big point Alex and Mia made, the delivery of these notices, how they get to the tenant, that's got to be done according to state law too.
So there are rules for everything.
Every step of the way.
Okay, so let's say a tenant gets one of these notices, but they just ignore it. What happens then?
That's when things can escalate to court.
Court. So it's not just the landlord wins automatically.
Nope, not that simple. The landlord actually has to file something called an unlawful detainer lawsuit.
Sounds serious.
It is. They're basically going to court and saying, hey, this tenant isn't holding up their end of the agreement.
And then what? Does the tenant get to defend themselves?
Absolutely. Remember, due process.
Right. Everyone gets their day in court.
Exactly. Both the landlord and the tenant get to present their case to a judge. It can become quite the legal battle.
Wow. So, a judge actually has to decide who's right.
That's right. And if the judge sides with the landlord, they issue something called a writ of possession.
A writ of possession?
Yeah, and that's kind of where things get really real.
How so?
A writ of possession basically gives the go-ahead for law enforcement to get involved.
Oh, so the landlord still can't just go barging in and throwing the tenant out?
Oh, no.
Changing the locks or something?
That's illegal. The landlord could get in big trouble for doing something like that.
So it's got to be done by the book?
Always. It's the sheriff or a marshal who actually carries out the eviction.
Wow. So even at this late stage, there's still a whole process.
Yep. Lots of rules to follow. And to be honest, it can be a pretty stressful situation for everyone.
I bet.
Yeah.
But, before we get too doom and gloom about all this, Alex and Mia did say there are alternatives to going to court.
Right, they definitely emphasize that it doesn't always have to end up in this big legal battle.
So what can people do instead?
Communication is key, like just talking things through. Sometimes a landlord and a tenant can work things out between themselves.
So like a payment plan, maybe?
Yeah, or if it's about a lease violation, maybe they can come to some agreement about how to fix
So
it.
they don't automatically have to go to court.
Exactly. It's worth trying to find a solution that works for both sides.
And Alex and Mia said there are resources out there to help people with this too, right?
Right. Like a lawyer or a local housing authority can give advice or even help mediate the situation.
That's good to know. So many people just don't realize that.
They think it's all or nothing.
Right. But it's a process. And knowing the steps can make a huge difference.
That's what we want people to take away from this deep dive. Evictions, they're complicated, but understanding the basics can empower both landlords and tenants.
It's about knowing your rights and your responsibilities.
Exactly. And it can help avoid a lot of unnecessary stress and conflict.
Well said. And that's it for today's deep dive. I hope everyone learned something new.
Me too. It's been fascinating.
It really has. And before we go, I've got to ask, how do you think this whole process balances the rights of landlords and tenants? Is it fair? It's a tough question, right? Something to think about.
A lot to consider.
A lot to consider. All right, everyone, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.
If this podcast helped you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps us keep making these videos. Thanks for watching.